Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Erdy. I'm a principal at Erdy McHenry Architecture. We're in Philadelphia. We have folks here with us from New York, Canada, across the office, and various other parts, and Purdue as well, so in Indiana. So welcome. This is the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, Living Off the Land presentation. It speaks about urban agriculture and all matters environmental related to food security and a little bit of housing. I want to introduce Hina Jamel. This is going in correspondence with the Weitzman School of Architecture at University of Pennsylvania, and Hina's going to talk a little bit about the housing studio that this is actually part of.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you very much for organizing the event for today with such an esteemed panel. And Scott has been part of the urban housing teaching team at the University of Pennsylvania for over 10 years now as a great colleague. And in that, we have revamped the curriculum a number of times. And starting in 2020, given the unprecedented, aspects that were happening in the world, both with George Floyd and also with the pandemic, we wrote this theme in regards to public common space. The urban housing studios at Penn are the second year of the Master of Architecture program. And so in writing this brief, we looked at a program of public common space that can be in conjunction with urban housing. And just to recap, and I'm sure everyone will get into this today, but public commons is a term used for shared and equitable resources such as the air, ocean, and wildlife. And public common space for the architecture studios is relaunched as a catalyst to study the confluences of equity and inclusion through thoughtful inquiry. So the students in the studio engage architects' agency for format spaces of equity, new sources of ground, landscape, and thresholds. And in doing so, I really see this symposium as a kickoff for that part of the studios at Penn.
Great, thank you. Hina has been very gracious in editing a book on the work of the studio. We're going to have a book launch at Penn on the 27th. If you're in Philadelphia, it'd be great. You're welcome to attend at 6:30 p.m. at the School of Design. So hopefully you can make it. Thank you very much, Hina.
Thank you, Scott.
So this has been approved for 1 hour of HSW AIA learning credits. So today participants are going to understand a little bit more about common space, public common space, and its relationship to public resources, even food as a resource. You're going to learn more about the carbon footprint of food production, also the vast amounts of embodied energy that exist in underutilized urban structures. And we're going to talk about public common space and how it can transform vacant abandoned properties and give you a better relationship between equitable public space and local communities. And we're going to also talk a little bit about the chronic causes of food deprivation and related to social stature. And you're going to learn a little bit more about strategies to address both food security, insufficient access to affordable housing, and employment. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Janine La Marca. She is the Director of Client Services, Healthcare, and the Life Sciences Division of JB&B Engineers. She's been a friend for many years. She's an outstanding collaborator on all things, and probably the thing that she does the best is bring people together of like interests. She's got a lot of certifications here, but know that you're in good hands with Janine. So Janine, do you want to take it? You're muted. The most used word in the dictionary now. You need to unmute, Janine.
Thank you so much, Scott. Those words are amazing. I really appreciate that introduction. So it is such an honor to be here today amongst these incredible panelists on this very important subject matter. We have an excellent panel of thought leaders that are going to address, as Scott said, public common space, food security, and how architecture, engineering, agriculture, science, and technology can provide new typologies and housing for self-sustaining models for cities. Our panelists will also answer what true farm to table means. And this subject is is regular access to food is especially fascinating to me, since I recently visited the country of Belize and toured one of the National Geographic's top 10 rated caves in the world, called Actun Tunachil Muknau, or simply ATM. You know, and the reason why it's so fascinating, in the Maya religion, the gods of agriculture, rain, and fertility were believed to reside in the underworld. The ATM cave, with its apparent endless pits, was considered a gateway. So somewhere between 700 and 900 AD, the most elite Mayans would make human sacrifices of their own children in this cave to appeal to these gods, and hopefully be relieved of the drought in order to grow crops to feed their starving villages. So fast forward 13 centuries, and fortunately, those are not the practices we use here and now to prevent starvation and provide ideal conditions for food production and safety. Today, we farm both outdoors and indoors using technology such as hydroponics and many other methods, as you'll learn from our panelists. So we couldn't have done this program without our sponsors. So thanks to those you see listed on this slide. And if you are interested, or your company is interested in supporting our chapter and becoming involved, contact Jared Green. So a little bit about CTBUH. Was founded in the US in 1969. It's become the world's leading nonprofit organization for those interested in the future of cities. It explores how increased urban density and vertical growth can support more sustainable and healthy cities, especially in the face of mass urbanization and the increasing effects of climate change worldwide. So again, our topic is very appropriate today. And as part of the wide array of membership benefits, as we'll talk about in this upcoming international conference, the Future City, you can see all the incredible topics that will be discussed. So hopefully you'll be able to join and become part of this conference, as well as get the member rate for our local programs. So with that said, I wanted to introduce Dr. Dickson Despommier. He's a microbiologist and ecologist and emeritus professor of public and environmental health at the Columbia University. For 27 years, he's conducted research on cellular and molecular parasitism and held lectures and courses on parasitic disease, medical ecology, and ecology. In 2010, he published his widely received book, The Vertical Farm, Feeding the World in the 21st Century, St. Martin's Press, New York. Today, there are hundreds of commercial vertical farms, with many more under construction. His idea was regarded as visionary several years ago, but today has become a beacon for the countries where food imports are high. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Dickson.
Thank you very much. Let me first start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate today. I am thrilled to be part of this scene. I had so many wonderful experiences in the past with the Tall Building Council. I actually knew one of the directors a long time ago, and I was invited to a meeting in Dubai to see the world's tallest building actually peek out at the tallest building. So there is some connections here. What I lectured on then, and what I will give you a thumbnail sketch of now, is the rise of indoor farming as it relates to multiple story buildings, which I have termed vertical farms. And it started as an idea in a classroom in 1999 with 7 students and myself. Actually, I turned out to be student number 8. And we all collaborated together to put our brains into one mode of thinking as to what might be done to help save this world from being mowed to the ground and making room for more farmland. Deforestation was the big issue, and it still is. And as we progressed through this course over the years, we evolved this idea of vertical farming, never expecting it, of course, to reach the state it's reached today, which is there are vertical farms. And that was a miracle in itself. How many of you can remember going to college and then getting out of college and then looking back and saying, you know, not that I didn't enjoy the experience, but virtually nothing that I learned in college applies to what I do now. Maybe I just learned how to think as an undergraduate, but that's part of the game. But in this case, the thinking process spilled over into the real world. So these pictures that you see on the front are just a screenshot from Google Images. When you type out the words vertical and then farm, this is what you get. In 2010, when this book was published, there were none. So that's why when you buy the book, don't. I can give you a different version to buy if you're interested. There are no pictures of vertical farms because there were none. Today, there are so many vertical farms that I've actually lost count of how many there are. This is a map that I generate every time I hear about a new one. I add a little red dot and I list the names of the vertical farms in a chart and a graph. This is, of course, a close-up of the United States as compared to the rest of the world. And then you can see here a partial list. And I mean, this is a partial list of the existing vertical farms that are out there and operational and presumably making a profit, selling a variety of crops that can be grown easily indoors. And I'll get to the crop selection in a moment. But for the most part, these people were very brave in starting their idea off by actually investing their life and money in this concept. It's thanks to them that this concept has survived and thrived. And now you can see how much it has thrived by looking at the number of hits that you will get on Google. When you do a search for the term vertical farm, that's 3 billion, not 3 million. I thought I saw 3 million when I first saw this, and I said, wait a minute, that's a billion, not a million. And Lord knows what the number actually means, but I think it means in essence that a lot of people are interested in this idea now. That's good news for the industry of vertical farming, which is now an industry. We can actually call it that now. It's generated several $1 billion worth of investment. And the prediction is in another 5 to 10 years, there'll be another doubling or tripling or who knows, quadrupling of the number of people interested in and the amount of money that people will put forth to make sure that this idea doesn't go away. The reason why we don't want this idea to go away is because of its usefulness in addressing this issue. This is a poster child picture for rapid climate change. And rapid climate change has altered the ecological picture of virtually every place on the planet. Some places get more rain. Some places get no rain. Some places are colder. Some places are warmer. The point is that we haven't yet learned how to predict where these places will be. So in that case, if you still want food on the table, we're going to have to find other ways of making that happen. And not that traditional farming is not worth anything. Of course, it's worth a lot. It actually got us here. 10,000 years of history says that vertical farming is a newcomer to an already tried and true practice of planting a seed in the ground, a little fertilizer, a little water, and pray for rain at the right time. Do not sacrifice your children in caves because for the most part, the earth will foster the growth of plants, regardless of the kind of plants. But nowadays, it's a little more problematic because the droughts are affecting places where we put a lot of investment into farming, and namely California, Texas, and Florida for the United States, and for other places too. All of Southeast Asia now gets monsoons coming at the wrong time, dumping too much water, floods result, and droughts result. And people then fold up their tents and move into the city looking for other employment. It's created hyper urbanization, which is an intractable problem of rapid climate change, which if we don't address this over the next 10 to 20 years, we may never be able to do that. Rapid climate change is real. I know there's a lot of doubters out there that claim that it's just part of the natural process. Well, if you want to say that, that's true because we are part of nature, but we have the ability to actually think our way through problems and to either solve them or to create them. And we've done a great job in both directions on that. So it's now our turn, after having created the problem of rapid climate change, to solve it. It's going to involve a number of approaches, but if you don't have enough to eat, it doesn't matter what else goes on. You have to solve that problem first. And since crops require water, an even temperature of various sorts, the right conditions, meeting those conditions outdoors is becoming more and more problematic. So that's why we began to think about growing crops indoors. And what you see here is not a architectural rendering of a proposed project that would never get built. This is an operational vertical farm in New Jersey called Aero Farms, and it employs aeroponics as its grow system. And this is a partial view of this building. And there are many more buildings like that that Aero Farms has now generated and expanded into various other cities besides Newark. They are one of the leaders in vertical farming. I'm proud to say that they were graduates of our Columbia Business School. So thank goodness some other ideas have escaped into the real world as well. The idea of growing food in indoors in a highly controlled setting is not appealing to a lot of people because they look at this as unnatural. But if you look back 10,000 years ago to the length of time that humans have been a species, namely for 300,000 years, the last 10,000 are the only time that people decided to grow food. And before that, they were hunter-gatherers. So farming is not so natural either. So if you look at farming in general, what is the best way to farm without harming the rest of the world? That's the big question. And for my money, the best way to do that is to do it in a space which we already own and which was never used for farming before, and that is the built environment. And this apparently has some appeal to other people as well. So these technologies are now being applied indoors, inside buildings, in large racks of food that are being bought at rapid rates. I mean, really, these things sell out within a day or two of being put on the shelf. So I'm very proud of the students that participated in this project, and I'm very excited about the direction that it's heading. If you want to know a lot more about this subject, obviously there are places to go to, and I recommend this, the newest edition of Vertical Farm. And in it, there's a new chapter showing all the new vertical farms that have come about since 2010. This was published last year. I told you I would take less than 10 minutes, and I hope I did. So with that, I will say thank you very much, and I will look forward to the rest of the presentations because I have a lot to learn.
Thank you so much, Dickson. That was amazing, really incredible. So on to my good friend, Scott Erdy. So Scott received his undergraduate degree from The Ohio State University and his master's from Syracuse. Since establishing Erdy McHenry Architecture with Dave McHenry, Scott's design work has received more than 30 state, local, and national awards. I'm not surprised. His work pursues a methodology where form embodies purpose and sense of place is revealed through careful intersection of program, site, and culture. His design for St. Aloysius Church was recognized by Arc Daily as one of the top 100 architectural projects in the US, as one of the 5 best churches of the world by World Build 365, beginning with the cover story of Architecture magazine featuring Southern Poverty Law Center, and most recently, the 2013 July cover of Architecture Record highlighted the Cornell Teaching Dairy Barn, the cleanest barn I've ever seen, actually. Scott's work has been recognized for the embodiment of both its cultural significance and utilitarian beauty. Over to you, Scott.
That was way too much, but thank you. So I'm going to talk briefly about some things that we research in the class and in the studio and in our office, this idea about living off the land, which is really, do we live off the land, meaning we're taking from the land, or we try to live and get off the land? If you look at this dwelling here, it's an extremely expensive, high-tech dwelling place to protect us. And if you look at Native Americans, the indigenous people of this country, they lived in harmony with the land, where they took things from the land to really create their homes and their spaces. So we're going to talk about 3 aspects of this: carbon, food security, and homelessness. And our desire at Erdy McHenry is that we can solve all of these in a single sort of aspect. So if you start with carbon and you look at how the carbon footprint per person has increased, it's just extremely dramatic. And you can see there have been these short lulls in that around the World War I, the Great Depression, the oil crisis of the 70s. And then you have to wonder, with COVID, will there be a lull in sort of our carbon output, which is hopeful, and prove that we can actually live and work in different ways. And if you see this map put together by NASA, you can see how the carbon emissions tend to generate themselves around the northern hemisphere, or the most developed parts of the city. So the primary thing about this is really food security. And as Dickson alluded to, our population over the next 50 years is going to increase to at least 9.3 billion. And with the current farming techniques, we're going to be required to basically have additional farmland the size of the country of Brazil. And that seems almost impossible if you think about the depletion of rainforest, those high carbon concentrate, those sequestration spaces. It's a very dangerous for us to think about turning hard woodland forest into farmland. And you can see here various degrees of where the ground gets stressed by this farming. And it's really, as Dickson said, an unnatural condition for that. And it leads to sort of monocultures. It leads to a lot of hazardous runoff, different in the heat island effect, and the low biomass of most plants that we grow to eat doesn't allow it to really absorb carbon. And the stress on the landscape is shown in this map here, where you see how the soil degradation happens across the world. And you can see there's not really enough farmland to be found in a climate where we could actually grow more food. And what does this mean for homelessness? It's all related. If you think about world population, just like the carbon increase, growing astronomically. And so if you think about where we are on this timeline of growth of the population, it's very scary. And there's some real world examples of what happens with this, both growth in population and rapid climate change. In 2016 alone, there were more than 60 million refugees moving around the planet to find a new place to live. And you compare that to 40 million that were displaced after the Second World War, it's really staggering. And if you don't think about just man-made events, but the man-made event of rapid climate change, some of the research we did pointed to this timeline of events. The uprising in Syria really was related in some parts to drought. So if you see on this this graph, you see certain droughts that existed over time, an increase in farming, which took people dependent on that system, and then the extended drought that began in 2005 really created a whole bunch of refugees. And we all know that how that turned out in Syria in terms of a very desperate situation. And it took one of the most beautiful cities in the world, Damascus, and really created this out of it. And it's such a sad hardship of space. And you can see some of that, the remnants of that. So these are in part caused not only by political uprising, but also by climate change and people needing to move into the centers of cities because there's a drought, there's nothing to eat. So the thing that we study is this notion of living off the land. So being that in our studio, we're designing housing that combines food growing as well as employment opportunities. And this idea isn't new. If you look at the Certosa di Firenze, just outside of Florence, this monastery represented an example where food was being grown in harmony with the housing. And so for some of you students of architecture, this is from Le Corbusier's sketchbook where he noticed that. And so there's subsistence farming around the perimeter of the monastery. And there's also personal farming that happens within each of those units so they can grow their staples within that area. And he later turned that into, in the portions of this Radiant City or his honeycomb housing, this idea of integration of food growth, gardens together with the housing. So it's very interesting. And the point of all this is really that if we can think about food coming from the bucolic countryside, these low biomass fields, which really don't do much to absorb the carbon that we're putting in the atmosphere, combined with suburban sprawl, taking up more of the land, keeping it from becoming these hardwood forests, it's really a problem. So the things that we look in our studio is really this idea of residential densification, where you get more people living in cities, which is good because we're taking up less land on the footprint. And if you think about combining the growing of that food with those buildings in urban areas, what you can do is you can really combine the food and the shelter together. And what can happen then with the countryside is all that carbon in the air can be absorbed by rewilding of the land. So you see here, if we can return that to natural woodlands or a natural condition of the earth, then the earth is capable of being a part of the solution if we do that as well. And it's really interesting, you know, more than a half a century ago, looking at this idea with his Radiant City plan, where his idea is densification and letting the land go to a more garden state. In our practice, we look at a number of different opportunities in this. This is a project in Birmingham, England, a housing project where we're trying to really rethink about what happens in an industrialized city, one of those cities that creates all the carbon, in terms of these gardens. So each of these spaces is really a micro garden or a winter garden that allows you to grow produce within that. And in this case, the scale is not such that it could feed the building, but it can certainly become a demonstration of the project, how you can integrate food and people. So here you see the greenhouse components where we use aquaponics and the idea that the fish work in harmony with the plants to both clean the water and actually fertilize the plants, and creates this this closed system that is really beneficial. Another project that we're looking at right now is called the hostel co-op, where this idea about like a student hostel could actually combine employment. So it's actually thought about in terms of the length of your stay based on the kinds of plants that could be grown in those periods of time. So a 1 to 4 week, 5 week, many microgreens can be grown as little as 10 days. So this idea about combining food and living is something that one could imagine the ability of this to solve the housing crisis, because the housing would be provided and the food would be provided all in one structure. So we thank Parkway Corporation for their involvement in this project that's ongoing. So for us, it's really about a holistic system in terms of how to help solve this problem of food security and the public common, or everybody's right to fresh food. This eliminates the travel time. It takes the food out of the countryside, allows that to become rewilded with hardwood forests, and it really creates a system that could give people a better life. So thank you.
Amazing, Scott. I think it might be wise to schedule a walkthrough through that model in Florence to give further case study it. But no, thank you so much. That was really incredible. So I wanted to introduce Alex Turkewitsch. He has been the president and greenhouse consultant for Greenhouse Engineering since March 1999. He designs greenhouse facilities of all types, ranging from plant production ranges, garden centers, shade houses, and lath houses to compartmentalize research greenhouses, conservatories, rooftop farms, and custom structures. Alex also performs inspections, commissioning services, project management, and engineering evaluations. Alex and Greenhouse Engineering are affiliated with many industry organizations. He obtained his Bachelor of Applied Science in Systems Design Engineering and Master of Applied Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Waterloo. Take it away, Alex.
Thank you, Janine. Just trying to get my screen up again here. So in many of the languages around the world, greenhouses are called grow houses. In fact, greenhouse is a reference to the plants that grow in it. So despite the fact that there are many types of glazed structures, greenhouses are specifically noted as being plant growth facilities. Many different types of structures. Here are some examples of greenhouse forms. They come in many different shapes and sizes. Traditional A-frame, whether it's a single span or a multi-span. arch houses. There's an interesting one, the open roof, where essentially the entire roof opens up to the sky, let in lots of air and lots of sun. A Dutch design, the Venlo house, highly modularized, very widely used for food production around the world. A lean-to house attached to the side of a building. This one happens to be curved because the building was curved. Or arch, ground-to-ground arches are also quite popular as lower tech growing facilities, as are A-frames, the Gothic arch, which permits more opening in the ridge vents. Finally, sawtooth designs, which are commonly used where prevailing winds are typical, and ventilate by exhausting air from the peak. Some of the design components of a greenhouse are intended to let the light in, to provide a different environment than the outdoors, particularly in the winter, but also in the summer, to support the crop. And last but not least, architectural interest. Some of the greenhouse systems that are employed are control systems, plant growing systems, and material handling systems. So when a greenhouse is planned, it's more than just a structure. There are many components that need to fit into a space and work together. So once we have the enclosure, here's an example of a Venlo house. We can add external shade cloth, internal shade cloth, sometimes in multiple layers, sidewall cloth. And since we're often lighting these structures quite heavily for winter production, light spill curtains are becoming more common to avoid light pollution of the surrounding areas and the sky for that matter. Outside solar radiation can be reduced by the exterior shades and the internal shades to reduce stress on the plants under very bright sun conditions, and also to manage temperature. Ridge vents are used with prevailing winds to admit fresh air and also to expel stale air from the roof. HVAC systems include many different types, but recirculating systems, outside air systems are often used. Fan coil units are sometimes used to boost the heat. Fog nozzles to humidify when the air is too dry. Lights to supplement natural light. And by manipulating the curtains and the lights, it's possible to manage many different conditions within the greenhouse under varying climate conditions. The air, water, and radiation flows are then modeled. The numbers simply refer to streams of either energy, air, or water. So you can see it's really a factory that involves many coincidental systems. Urban rooftops are an ideal location for greenhouses. For one, gets them up and out into the air and into the sun. Number two, removes them somewhat from street pollution. And number 3 uses areas which are not productive. As you can see in this, the left photo, the rooftop basically just has some HVAC units on it. Fill it with a greenhouse and it becomes productive space. So what do we need to do to provide the necessities of life for the plants and to keep them happy? Light. Plants need light to grow. And there are several systems and methods that we can use to manage and enhance light. Temperature. We need to raise the temperature when it's too low, lower the temperature when it's too high. It's not just the air, it's also the microclimate, the roots, the leaves, and the fruit. Air movement is important as well for gas exchange as well as for ventilation. Air moisture, very important. If the air is too dry, the plants become stressed. If the air is too humid, disease problems can ensue. Plants need water and they need feeding as well. Uniformity is important, particularly when you want to produce a crop that will be harvested to a schedule. And managing change is very important as well. I'm going to take a couple of these topics and very quickly go through some interesting developments in lighting and ventilation. Plants use light differently from the way we perceive light. And therefore, we use a different method of measuring light. We use a quantum measure, which is micromoles per square meter per second. Most greenhouse crops need around 400 to 500. And since that's often not available in higher latitudes, grow lights are often used to supplement. Across the country, we see great variations in available light. These are daily light integrals, which is the accumulation of light over a day. And the charts on the right show the accumulation month by month. This guides us in selecting the lighting that's necessary. Greenhouses are essentially solar collectors, and therefore cooling them and venting them is really important. A lot of work has been done on this. Evaporative cooling is a highly efficient way of cooling greenhouses in that it uses the evaporation of moisture, adds humidity to the air, which is beneficial to the plants. Here are some evaporative cooling methods that are used. Cladding is also important. It keeps the greenhouse separate from the environment. Some advances in greenhouse cladding are to use low iron glass with haze and anti-reflection coatings, which enhance the plant growth inside. Relatively new to the industry is ETFE film. On the bottom right is a rendering of a project that Erdy McHenry and Greenhouse Design Group are working on at The Ohio State University. The larger greenhouses in the back are fully clad with ETFE. Integrated photovoltaics are of interest as well. Here's some work being done at the North Carolina State University. Quantum dot technology is used to transform blue high energy radiation to lower energy green, yellow, and red radiation to enhance plant growth. I often look to the industry meetings to see what's new and in the near future. And here's 3 winners of the Greenhouse Technology Awards handed out last week at the Greenhouse Canadian Greenhouse Conference. Lighting. Solum Technologies came up with a fully modulating LED lighting fixture that allows spectral control as well as intensity control. Plant pest monitoring is extremely important in greenhouses. Greenhouses do keep outside pests out, but they are breeding grounds for indigenous pests. Scout Tech has come up with a new tool to enhance pest management. And finally, artificial intelligence and the autonomous greenhouse is coming down the pipe. Blue Radix is a company that's developing a controller to do this. Finally, a drone pollinator developed by Jiro Miyako. And I thought that was quite cute, if not interesting. Just wonder what the drone is reporting back to the hive. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alex. Wow, I can see why you're a greenhouse consultant. That was so educational. Really appreciate that. I never knew there were so many varieties of greenhouses myself, but thank you. So on to introduce Walter Mehl, managing partner of JB&B, who I am extraordinarily proud to work with. He is a principal electrical engineer for numerous new construction and retrofit projects within the US and internationally. He also has the principal responsibility for technologies, the low voltage services arm of JB&B, which supports the IT, security, audiovisual, RF engineering, building OT, cybersecurity, and smart building design service offerings. Regarding sustainability, Walter has been actively involved in the implementation of JB&B's Deep Carbon Reduction Initiative to support clients on their path towards lower carbon emissions through proactive sustainable design and implementation of highly effective energy efficiency and capital improvement strategies. So with that said, let's light this candle, as Walter likes to say.
Thank you, Janine. I'll jump right into it, make sure that we're staying on track in terms of time today. As you go late into in this presentation, you're going to hear some things the second time, and I harken back to what a professor said to me in my collegiate years, that you have to be taught something 3 times and teach it once yourself, and then you finally know it. So if you're hearing something for the second time today, that's part of that being taught 3 times. I'd like to touch on some of the things that Alex just touched on, as well as what was mentioned earlier by Dickson. Focusing on the MEP and the support systems in the building. Now, Alex just kind of went over more greenhouse, but vertical farming can not only be done in a greenhouse, but it can be done in a multi-level structure where there might not be green visible access to the sun during the day, but in fact, your only real access to sunlight would be around the perimeter. As you saw with the aero farms, you had multi-tiered stack of growth occurring just on a single level. So a lot of that was done with artificial light. So you have to ask yourself, what's required on the MEP side? Does it make sense? And then where are we going in terms of energy and carbon? Okay. Well, as we just covered, we know that these growth facilities, when they don't have direct access to the sun, are going to be light intensive, depending on the crop and depending on the cycles and the number of cycles are due per year. It's pretty intense lighting, and we'll cover the watts per square foot in a minute. And besides that, on the HVAC side, to cool, heat generated not only by the lights and the intense lighting, but also there's energy being transferred by the plants themselves, both during the day and at night. And then ventilation needs to be, air movement down through the growth needs to occur. So it's not only setting the capacity for the room, but making sure that it's distributed throughout so that all crop within a level is under the same environmental conditions. So what that means is you're gonna have some high operating expenses for lighting and HVAC. And then along with that, you think about your total OpEx, you're gonna need technical know-how. You're gonna have to have personnel that understand how to operate these complex systems. In fact, there was a slide I saw earlier, and by the time it was done, it was almost a spaghetti bowl of control flow between MEP systems. you can put the greatest systems in the building, but if they're not controlled properly, the crop will suffer. And then, of course, on the CapEx side, we mentioned lighting, HVAC, BMS controls. And then depending on the nature of the crop and where we are, there's going to be security, and then the structure itself. If it's a greenfield construction of a new building, that's going to present a cost. Whereas if it's possibly a repositioned or repurposed existing structure, there could be a great savings on the CapEx with an existing building. But just to touch on the lighting again, depending on the crop, depending on the number of tiers, depending on the density of the growth approach, and the number of cycles per year, all of that will drive your lighting solution. And clearly, multiple tiers, again, as you saw in that earlier Aero Farms image from Newark, New Jersey, you could have lighting densities that could exceed 50 watts a square foot. By comparison, with a lot of the new energy laws that have crept into the sectors that are not a nascent sector like vertical farming, we're down to barely 1 watt a square foot. In fact, recent designs on commercial structures, we were sub a half a watt a square foot. So what you have here is a magnitude of 50 to 100 times where we've seen lighting on the commercial side. Likewise, on the HVAC, with humidity control, temperature control, and as I mentioned earlier, literally distribution, making sure that every crop is on the same level as the crop on the end to the crop in the middle in terms of the conditions it's under. And operational around the clock, not just during the day. You think of a commercial office building, staff goes home at night, you can turn down the systems. Well, the plants are still active at night. So there's still HVAC obligations around the clock, 24/7. When you total up the lighting, the HVAC, and other support systems, a vertical farm, a multiple level high-rise building could be 80 to 100 watts a square foot, possibly higher, of the planted area. By comparison, a commercial office building may only be 4 to 6 watts on the gross. A data center is very similar to 80 to 100. So you say to yourself, that's a lot of energy. That's a lot of CapEx to be put in a building. Why would we want to do this? There's many reasons. Some of those have been touched on earlier. Reason number one, you may have a building that can be repurposed. And as we're living right now in the COVID world, there's a lot of commercial landlords saying, what can I do with this asset? There's not as much need on the commercial side. So can I repurpose this to be some other type of sector? Water supply. We've read recently in the San Joaquin Valley of California, wells are drying up. Residential water supply has gone to zero because farming has drawn the water supply out of the ground. Vertical farming is using 1% of the area and 5% of the water. When you think about outdoor climates, the news, a lot of that we report as weather now and climate. One bad storm can wipe out a crop. Inside a building, you've got a controlled environment. Reduction in pesticides, better crop yield without the insects and destruction that can come from the outside. And then by moving the vertical farming closer to the user versus a California or Midwest supply trying to get to Philadelphia, your crop yield will go up even further because the produce will remain fresher longer. It's grown locally, it's picked locally. With that, you'll have reduced waste. So you take a step back and say 80 to 100 watts a square foot, heavy CapEx on a building. But if I have an existing building, if water supply is a hardship, and it's becoming more and more of a hardship, if arable land is lost or you're in a dense urban environment, and now I've reduced transportation and the carbon impact that driving and delivering produce across the US entails, when I reduce pesticides and herbicides, when I secure the crop, there's an equation that can almost be written, whether it's energy use or the carbon footprint or just on yield, and I created a little bit of a heat map here where red might be bad and green is good, you can't just look at the 80 to 100 watts a square foot for the building or what the cost of putting those systems in the building would be. You have to look at the total solution. And that's probably what we're going to start to see in the future in 2.0 and 3.0 versions of carbon measures. I think there's approximately 40 cities across the US where there's now carbon laws or carbon laws are on their way. So it's coming to a theater near you. And with that, we'll hand it off to Nyasha.
Thank you, Walter. Well, you demonstrated to everybody on this call why it's a pleasure working with you. So I've learned so much every day. Thank you for that. With that said, I wanted to introduce Nyasha Felder. Nyasha holds a master's degree in both architecture and landscape architecture from the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. In her professional career, she has produced work centered on the African-American experience to create inclusive and socially aware public spaces. She is also an active volunteer and lead designer for the North Philadelphia Peace Park, where she has helped to facilitate community engagement events and the conceptualization of the Peace Pavilion in partnership with BCJ Architects prior to joining Erdy Henry. Take it away, Naya.
Thank you, Janine, and thank you everyone for attending this afternoon. I'm honored to be a part of this discussion. It has been an intellectual journey for me as well as a practical one as we imagine how to apply many of these theories in our current project with PHA and North Philly Peace Park. And I hope today that my talk will provide a broad lens into understanding some benefits and opportunities offered by urban agriculture. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we had this issue earlier. One moment. Okay. I hope that today my talk will provide a broad lens into understanding some benefits and opportunities offered by urban agriculture and highlight some developments that our local governance organizers and activists have begun to leverage in evaluating the potential of urban farms and the potential for new territories. I will also discuss some of the social ecological patterns and impacts that we are researching to overlay potentials at a local and individual scale. So Philadelphia presents a very acute example of radicalizing common space, especially within the last year, where multiple social justice organizations formed a coalition that impacted how public health needs are provided during a global crisis. It was during this crisis that we realized the vulnerability of our food supply system, as many families have suffered from food shortage. In Philadelphia, as food security and housing became critical during the pandemic, a local coalition of community organizers moved at least 40 families into vacant buildings, predominantly owned by PHA in the city. Also, as development stalled in many parts of the country, Iglesias Garden protested a non-transparent sheriff sales of delinquent properties through the land bank and the arduous acquisition process for communities seeking to own land inside in Philadelphia. What these trends point out, as Sheila Fox demonstrated in many of her discussions, many of her discussions on the Coast City project, mapping the urban commons. This calls to question how we perceive accessibility and human rights and the human rights to housing and food based on our existing understanding of the commons and the socio-ecological impact the commons have on our environment. Current studies estimates suggest that the urban area contribute to at least 70% of energy-related emissions, with the urban food system significantly contributing 20 to 30% of global greenhouse emissions based on consumption-related emissions. Ultimately, the success of driving down greenhouse gas emission rates are dictated by our success on a municipal level to meet the global long-term emissions reduction targets. In order to guide efforts to address this, recent research has explored the greenhouse mitigation potential from urban activities. At 20 to 30% of global greenhouse emissions, a substantial contribution of the food system to climate change necessitates that an increasingly urban population take action to reduce the carbon intensity of their consumption. So what are some ways we can reduce emissions while addressing our current food shed deficit? As you can see, within our 100-mile food shed radius, we currently have a deficit of over 2 million acres of farmland that is needed to meet our current demands. To effectively respond to these growing demands on our food system, the need for accessible housing and food is critical to understanding where these opportunities are located and how they emerge. Data collected from various sources reveal community gardens are predominantly located in low-income Black and Brown communities in Philadelphia. We currently occupy the traditional territory of the Nyasha La Marca, whom have lived in this territory for thousands of years in harmony. And during the colonial period, many of them were displaced or moved west. Also during this period, maroon societies in the South were resistant communities that allowed for runaway slaves and natives and the European indentured servants to live freely and in peace, taking something dismal and making it home. They used natural resources found in the swamps and practiced non-waste material repurposing. Historians have found such places such as the Great Dismal Swamp located in southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, where communities were formed in resistance to slavery and were representative of the initiative and autonomy of the people. During the Great Migration, 80% of African Americans from the South lived in cities, and this zeal for democracy and human rights was carried to urban areas where they practiced yard gardening out of necessity and autonomy. Some pioneers in urban agriculture include Haiti Carbine, Carthen, who in the early 1900s, she was a community activist and also an environmentalist. She was instrumental in improving the quality of life in Brooklyn, where she helped to plant over 200 trees. And also, I'm sorry, it's not coming up. Existing efforts, as you can see, are as urban gardens benefits are increasingly being discussed, some existing efforts that are being made within the city have begun to work with community gardens and organizations, such as Soil Generation Interface Studio, Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, and a new subcommittee within the city called the Urban Agriculture Subcommittee, which was established last year, have begun to survey places where community gardens currently exist and the potential for them to expand through the city and what benefits they could potentially have. An important goal for the collaborative's work is to quantify the value of these urban parks and how these spaces may contribute to the city in ways that are outside of the market sphere. They've also begun to identify some typologies with identifying over 418 urban farms within the city. We are interested in identifying new possibilities for technology to also expand how food is grown and also the social economic impacts that may benefit the community. We are currently investigating the potential of North Philly Peace Park, which is located in the Charleswood community, for a block design and future development. Going into the planning process, we began by identifying questions to help us frame the place and surrounding context. Ultimately, place is about experience, preserving memory, and creating conditions that evoke new memories. We began with idea generation instead of typologies to embrace the non-standard ways the Peace Park has thought about landscape as something that is informal, hybrid, and based on use. This hybrid cultural landscape is important for us to evoke the idea of openness, sovereignty, education, and community building. Many benefits of community gardens that are less tangible, but are just as important, are exposure to green space and how it affects the health, and also how it aids in community building and shared resources. Along with ecosystem services and cultural ecosystem services, which are focused on people and social benefits, consuming local food is also better for the environment. Urban farms have been found to reduce crime and provide health benefits. And we demonstrate this through mapping using spatial data that combined with like land cover to look at some of the social economic parameters that exist within these areas. And to overlaying these different conditions, we can begin to see critical areas that have potential to meet multiple conditions, such as heat vulnerability, poverty, vacancies, food distribution, and access, as well as the potential for green infrastructure and reducing the carbon footprint. To illustrate this point, let's say hypothetically, we potentially have about 3,000 acres of available vacancies in Philadelphia. Let's say we plant 1 tree per acre. That will sequester about 144,000 pounds of carbon per year. And that's equivalent to about 200 cars. In a healthy forest, about 40 to 60 trees can be planted per acre. And at 3,000 acres, a max potential of over 180,000, a max potential of over 8 million carbon dioxide can be sequestered per year. And that is equivalent to about 850 cars. Many of these benefits of urban green space are not easily quantifiable, but what they do demonstrate is that we need data in order to help to identify ways that they can contribute to the city and the invaluable assets that they provide to the social ecosystem. On an individual level, emissions per person vary greatly among city and suburban zip codes. The zip code of 19121, which is within Charleswood, I use this example to demonstrate how a change in accessibility to local food can reduce carbon emissions. I use a family of 4 to demonstrate what is the average yearly household carbon footprint. In this case, is equivalent to about 49 metric tons per year. And that's also factoring in transportation, as well as how many people are in a household. In an article published by Philadelphia Inquirer, depending on the zip code, the carbon footprint can vary greatly. Society Hill, for instance, average person is 24 metric tons, whereas in places in the suburb is a much higher because that is also taken into factor in transportation. And so what this demonstrates is how communities can how communities can use urban farms for multiple benefits, as well as what are some of the conditions that we can begin to map out in order to demonstrate the value within urban agriculture. Thank you, and I look forward to any of your questions.
Thank you, Naya. I love the information about the carbon footprint. That was really interesting. So really appreciate your time there, and keep on doing what you're doing at the Peace Park. It's great stuff. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Mitch Tuinstra. He is the Wickersham Chair of Excellence in Agriculture Research and Professor of Plant Breeding and Genetics in the Department of Agronomy at Purdue University. He studies how crop plants grow in stressful environments. Mitch and his collaborators are responding to concerns of change in our climate to develop climate resilience. Climate resilient crops that will continue to the adaptation of agriculture to warmer and drier environments. Mitch's research focuses on identifying genes and genetic resources that contribute to improved crop performance in stressful environments. This work is done in collaboration with scientists and breeders in North America, Africa, and Asia. Over to you, Mitch.
Thanks, Janine. First off, I'd like to just thank the organizers for this webinar for an opportunity to bring this topic that I've invested my career working on. I actually grew up in a greenhouse production facility in Southwest Michigan, so I'm familiar with the challenges of producing fresh fruits and vegetables and horticulture production systems. And over the last few decades, I've been working more specifically on agronomic crops. And what I wanted to talk to you about just for a few minutes this afternoon is food futures, and particularly the challenge that we face in adapting crops to changing climates. So I oftentimes think about what are our grand challenges? Where should I be investing my time? And for me specifically, the grand challenge of agriculture is that we need to double our global food, feed, fiber, and fuel production in the 21st century in the face of a changing climate. Doubling production in our current environments would be challenging enough, but to do that in the face of climate change is particularly challenging, particularly when we also want to enhance soil, water, and air quality, biodiversity, and ecosystem health. And we have to be able to do it in an economically viable and socially responsible way. So for my own work, the work of the students in my lab, we work on breeding for climate resilience and C4 crops, the crops that I work on, corn and sorghum and pearl millet. Plant breeders over the last 40 or 50 years have really made tremendous gains in improving crop tolerance to environmental stresses. You can see this picture on the bottom of the slide. We see a gentleman standing in a rice paddy in the Philippines. And what he's demonstrating is the products of a product of plant breeding, where plant breeders incorporated a gene for flooding tolerance into rice. And he's actually pointing to a traditional variety that there was just a little bit too much rain early in the season, and the variety flooded out. And the new variety is on as we're looking at it, to his left is a beautiful stand of paddy rice where there is essentially no losses. And this is what happens when you breed for climate resilience. It's not just in rice that we're seeing these advances, we're seeing them in all crops that plant breeders are working on. And one of the biggest challenges moving forward is not individual stresses, whether that's flooding stress tolerance or heat stress tolerance or drought stress tolerance. The big challenge moving forward is we oftentimes need to integrate multiple types of tolerances into a single variety. It might be wet early in the season and dry late in the season. At Purdue, we're working on trying to develop a research platform that allows us to explore these eventualities of the environment. And so the first thing I want to talk to you about is a facility that we've developed to simulate future scenarios of the climate. This facility that you can see in the picture on the left is called the Ag Alumni Seed Phenotyping Facility. If you look at, there's that bright spot in the picture, that's the door is open to the largest conviron growth chamber in North America. We'll go and look in there in just a minute. But that growth facility accommodates up to 256 plants at a time. The plants are grown under very precisely controlled conditions for light and temperature and humidity. The plants are, all of the movement in the facility is automated, so the plants are actually moved around the facility on these conveyor belts. If you peek inside the door, this is what you see. This is the plants in the grow room. They can be managed to whatever type of condition the researcher is interested in. And it really focuses on trying to understand plant responses to these kinds of stressful conditions. In addition to growing them in the growth chambers, these plants are actually called out of the growth chambers on these automated conveyor belts to imaging booths. One of the imaging booths is the RGB imaging station. You can see in the pictures on the bottom of the slide here, we're growing basil and tomatoes and wheat, corn and sorghum, and we're using an RGB imaging system, a top view and side view system, measure the geometric properties of the plants as they grow. Plants can be imaged every day, and we can use that information to understand how plants grow over time. There are also another of the stations is the hyperspectral imaging station. Again, we have a top scan and side scan imaging facility that allows us to look at the spectral characteristics of plants from 400 nanometers up to 2500 nanometers. And if you look at those pictures on the right, this is the top left there is a wheat plant. On the top right is basil, bottom left is sorghum, bottom right is corn. And you can see there's a lot of variability in these plants as they're exposed to different sorts of environmental production conditions. And these imaging systems allow us to understand that spatial variation in these characteristics of the plants. And we know that it's not just the above ground part of the plants that are important. We also have an X-ray CT imaging station. We're able to pull the plants in front of an X-ray CT imager. In this case here in the bottom left, we have a tomato plant in the imaging spot. And the X-ray CT image allows us to reconstruct in a non-destructive way the three-dimensional architecture of the roots underground. So we can understand variability of the plants above ground and the variability of the plants, the roots that we can't see in the pot. So we're doing this under very controlled conditions in our controlled facility, but we also need to be able to assess variability in plants and field environments. We do that in this particular facility. It's called the Indiana Corn and Soybean Innovation Center. It's adjacent to campus on a farm about 1,700 acres, where we are able to characterize plants for the same kinds of attributes that we were looking at in the indoor environment and the controlled environment. We can actually look at the plants in the field environments as well. This is a 25,000 square foot facility that accommodates plant and seed processing, threshing and shelling, seed storage, cold storage, and there's essentially a phenomics tool development space where we work with our engineering colleagues to develop new tools to study plants as they grow in these types of environments. This takes a lot of data, and so we have a high-speed data transfer back to the high-performance computing cluster on campus, and we have a shared pool of instruments that researchers can use and check out on a daily basis. We use different types of platforms. That machine on the left there, we call it the PhenoRover. It's a ground-based system with sensors mounted across the top of the toolbar that allows us to look at plants by driving over them and looking down on them using the PhenoRover. Or we use a UAV, that's a DJI M600, with different sorts of sensors attached. In this case, it's a LiDAR 3D point cloud generating system, a hyperspectral line scanner, and an RGB camera that we can use to study plants growing in these environments. So we get the same types of data as we get on the indoor environment. We've installed this particular facility is an imaging gantry on the top left there. On the top of that rail, you'll see a shuttle with sensors mounted to it that allow us to have very high resolution, temporal and spatial resolution images of plants growing under different types of conditions. And again, what these systems allow us to do is to understand plants growing in these complex environments and to understand how can we modify these plants genetically to improve their adaptation. So just to wrap up my part of the talk here, I just wanted to say a couple of things. There's a lot of opportunities remain for identifying and deploying genes and alleles that sustainably enhance productivity of crops in hot and dry environments. We talked a little bit today about indoor production environments, urban production environments. I hope I gave you a little bit of an appreciation for the massive scale of rural production environments across the United States and in fact across the world, where a lot of the calories that we consume on a daily basis are actually produced. The continued adaptation of these food crops will be crucial to ensuring our global food security.
Well, that was really great. Thank you for your education and sharing that with us and all you're doing at Purdue. It's really incredible. So I just wanted to encourage all of our participants to put your questions in the chat. We're going to have a Q&A discussion here, and I'm just going to start by asking some questions, and anyone on the panel can feel free to jump in and answer. So when people talk about farm to table, how do the topics that we have discussed relate?
Well, I'll start. I think what's interesting is farm to table. If you have a garden at your house where you're either growing vegetables or herbs, farm to table is, as simple as reaching outside. And I can't imagine a lower impact of getting your food to table than something where you're growing your food right next to your house. And I think that's the part of what we're super interested in is like, how do you make that where you get a fresher product and a lot more control over your food supply? And, with that, you can control what type you grow, what type of fertilizer you use, if you use pesticides at all. So for me, it's a super exciting thing about farm to table can really happen, not in just a rural environment, but in an urban environment.
Great.
I can say something more about that if you don't mind,
Please.
Scott,
Please
because people, when they think about farm to table, they think about food miles. And they think, oh, well, that burns so much fossil fuels and we want to get rid of it for that reason. But actually, that's not the case. The shipping of massive quantities of food together lowers the per crop or per unit of corn, let's say a bushel of corn or wheat. So the food miles burning fossil fuels is not the issue that I would focus on. What I would recommend is that look at the loss in quality of the food that waits for after harvest to be packaged up, to be put onto a conveyor of some sort, and then to be shipped to a particular area. By the time it gets to where it's supposed to go, if it's being sold, then it has to go to the store. Then there's a lot of other handlings that have to go on with these crops in order for them to reach the table. And in doing so, I can tell you that some crops are ephemeral with regards to their nutrition, and mostly the leafy green vegetables, the ones that contain the elements of nutrition that you would really like young children to have because they're in growing stage. We lose those nutritional values when we delay eating the crop from the time it's harvested until the time it gets to the table. So if you could make the crop grow in your kitchen, which is ideal, I think that's what Scott probably has in mind for some of these projects at least. That would be ideal. You just go in the kitchen and pick it and eat it. And so I can tell you that there are restaurants now out there that have vertical farms on their roofs. There's one in Utrecht that has 3 stories of vertical farming. It's called Green House. That's the name of the establishment. And the food doesn't get fresher than that. The food, the farm is the restaurant, and the table is where you sit down and pay to eat, obviously. But that's as close as you can get to owning a farm in your kitchen.
Yeah, I think your point, Dickson, about eliminating transportation or ignoring transportation is a fair one. I live in New Jersey, and my farm to table lasts about 3 or 4 months of the year.
Right.
Because it won't be long before the leaves will be all off the trees and snowflakes will be falling. So, during this COVID time, when we had a little bit more working from home, I found myself going out and taking a break and doing a phone call in the garden and, grabbing the vegetables right from there. But that only lasts until September for us. We're getting a little longer stretch this year in October because of the warmer weather.
That's right.
But at this point, we lose that.
Exactly. If you do it outdoors.
Correct.
Where in New Jersey do you live?
Right in the middle.
I think that there's some new opportunities also. We're seeing some really clever entrepreneurs today that are developing new appliances that consumers can put in their house, essentially little mini greenhouses.
Exactly.
Or there are new paradigms for buying food if I go to my local grocery store, I buy herbs and pots and I put them on the window by my kitchen sink. And I have a whole garden right behind my sink that I harvest all winter long and all summer long, because as the point that was made a few minutes ago, oftentimes if I go to the grocery store and I buy something that's already been picked and is in the cooler, it doesn't have near as much of the aromatic and flavor profiles as a freshly picked, basil plant or leaves from a basil plant, for example.
Yeah, I think diet also plays a significant role too. Meat in general has a much larger carbon footprint than produce. So just changing your diet also when it comes to like farm to table, the vegetables that grow within there, like in someone's backyard, that may reduce it like somewhat, but I think when we have this discussion about like reducing carbon footprint, the diet of meat or like a primary meat diet has a significant role in contributing to greenhouse gases. I'm not suggesting that everyone will become vegan, but or vegetarian, but it does have more of an impact. Yeah,
That's another symposium.
Yeah.
Well, it is true. It is true in terms of the food that we eat. I think there's a growing awareness about the food that we eat and the ramifications of that, right? I think this past year and a half, if we think about, back to the initial thing that Hannah talked about in terms of how we've changed our perception based on things that have happened in our world, right? COVID, the sort of the Black Lives Matter movement, other things that brought about a heightened awareness about who we are and how we exist within a cultural environment. I think that that's also expanding to food, and I think we, as all citizens of the earth, try to be responsible in the sense of understanding where we sit with that. I think it's a great thing. So kudos to you, Nya, and to you, Dickson, who really started this movement. At least for me, when we first met, several years back, it's been a great transformation for my awareness, for one.
Well, you have become the teacher. I have become the student.
Not at all.
So we have a good question in the chat. What is the carbon footprint of the energy required to maintain appropriate light and temperature characteristics to effectively grow a food supply?
Wow. Depends on where you live, isn't it?
It depends on how big a net, right, Dickson? Talk about the whole net, not just the building.
That's right. So if I lived in places like Iceland or Italy or southern United States in the Southwest, or where we had access to geothermal energy, the South Island of New Zealand, for instance, you wouldn't be asking that question. You would ask a different question, because the energy consideration is not driving the price of the produce that you're going to produce for that. Renewable energy is absolutely essential to make indoor farming practical. And so we now have an indoor farm going up in Copenhagen, which is using all of its energy from the wind power that the entire country accesses offshore. And it will generate absolutely a zero carbon footprint in terms of the energy that it uses. If you want to consider building the wind farm to begin with, of course, that's the embedded carbon for the project. But after that, we have free access to it, and eventually it'll pay itself off. So if you choose your area correctly, and you look around the world for a place which has got zero cost for energy, and there are many of those places, by the way, you can get away with not having to consider this. But when you do consider it, then you look around for the price of a kilowatt of hour, and an hour of kilowatt electricity, I should say. And it turns out Las Vegas is one of those places which no one would expect anything good coming out of except loss of money from your own pocket. But what you find is that because of the renewable energy sources that they now have access to, including solar farms, some hydropower, although that's been diminished by the drought, and other solar projects on its way, companies have actually located to Las Vegas to produce food indoors because the price is right. The price of a kilowatt hour there, last time I looked, it was about 8 cents a kilowatt hour, which is ridiculous compared to New York, which is over 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So those are other considerations, but I'm sure other panelists have other ideas about that.
If you take carbon as a bigger part of sustainability, I think the other big issue is water. You know, where are we depleting the water sources, and where best to modify how we grow crop and use a lot less water?
Right, switch to aeroponics.
Another question in the Q&A is, if we use Mitch's forecast that we need to double food production by the end of this century, I'm curious whether anyone has calculated the footprint requirement in square feet if that necessity was accommodated entirely using urban farming controlled environment strategies.
Oh, right. Give me a couple of months on that. I'm actually doing just that right now as we speak, but to know whether it's practical or not would require a lot of trial and error on everyone's part to make sure that you got the model right before you started mass producing food indoors to replace all the outdoor food. I hate to say this, but I think the trend right now for climate change is that we will not have a choice. It doesn't matter how much it costs, we'll have to do it. Otherwise we won't eat.
Yeah, I think you know, it's interesting that you know, the amount of space that's saved by farming in a building, like vertical farming, right? 1 to 10 ratio at a minimum that you save on the ground that you would use otherwise is a great point. If you talk about the issues about the land area needed to feed the growing population, and then on top of that, Mitch's points about climate change, it's truly amazing. And I agree, it's not going to be a choice. The power is going to be, you know, the cost of the power is going to be the last thing we think about. It's going to be the cost of life. And I think if you compare that to sort of what the military spends for, you know, the opposite end of that life spectrum, you know, if we as a world could sort of redirect some of that, you know, we'd probably be have less conflict, right? So as the Syria, you know, example pointed out, I think it's a critical thing. And I've put a plug in for our studio. So for some of the things we're talking about, Dickson, December 10th, our final review, we're going to have a series of projects that combine urban agriculture and living, and some clever ways that try to take advantage of natural resources that exist on the site and in the particular climate. So everybody's welcome to come by University of Pennsylvania on December 10th.
I have a point. I'd like to challenge Dickson. When you're doing your math and computing the carbon footprint, to think a little bit about the other challenge that we haven't really talked about in this discussion, which is something like 2/3, 70% of the calories that 7.5 billion people eat come from rice and wheat and corn and potatoes.
Yes.
And the last time I checked, at my own production greenhouse, they're not the best choice of crops put inside. So as we start thinking about, I think that vertical farming is a tremendous opportunity in terms of addressing a certain subset of problems, but we have this bigger problem as well around some of our key agronomic crops, the cereals, especially the cereals, and in terms of potato, everybody likes French fries, but all the other applications of potatoes as well, all the other ways that I like to consume them. And I think we have to think a little bit about finding that balance between some crops are likely to be outside in a field production environment, and other crops are much better equipped to thrive inside, especially the green leafy veg, and many of these are nutrient rich elements of our food that are not very many calories, but they're important from the nutrient side of the equation, right? And so trying to find this balance between calorie production, if you want to call it that, starch production, complex cereal and grain legume production, and the production that's impossible, or at least in today's terms, and I'm not saying it's not possible to produce some of these things inside. And I know that moving forward, we're going to find ways to do that because that's human ingenuity. But today, and for the next few decades, we're going to be struggling with finding this balance between sort of field production and controlled vertical horticultural production questions.
If I could respond to that just briefly. I don't mean to dominate this discussion because it's obvious that there's it's multifactorial, it's time dependent, it's culture dependent, it's economically dependent. But there was a book written by a guy by the name of William Garrick back in 1937 called Soilless Agriculture. And the first crop he produced were potatoes. And the potatoes were suspended off of floating platforms that he put the eyes of the potatoes on and then allowed them to grow and use the nutrient solution below to attract the root systems. Plants grew up on top, of course, and in about 2 months, he could raise these lattice works of plant growth systems up out of this morass of liquid that no one believed anything was happening in, and he could feed a small army with all the potatoes that he grew. If you now go online and just type out hydroponic potatoes, you get so many permutations on this theme. Potatoes are like 400 varieties from Peru to begin with. They grow in the poorest soils in the world at the highest altitudes. They're the easiest thing in the world to grow because they don't require a lot of the stuff that, let's say, tropical or subtropical or temperate zone plants even. These are, subalpine Arctic plants that you're talking about here, and they're the toughest plants on the planet. Powdering them up and making a starchy reserve out of it is an easy way to store potato. And so I think potatoes, I wouldn't take those off your list, but I would certainly keep rice and corn and wheat on them. And you might want to look up an article we just recently published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where we actually calculated what it would take to grow enough wheat to replace the amount of wheat grown in Nebraska. And I can tell you that it's a lot. It's a big effort and it's a lot of investment. And if you want wheat, this is what you're going to have to do. But we calculated in a square mile of about 10 square miles of space, indoor space, you could replace the entire crop of outdoor wheat in Nebraska if you had the money and the time to do it. So I think it's a matter of wanting to do something bad enough to invest in the future. And I think, I agree with you. I think over time, the ingenuity factor will come into play and people will figure it out and say, why didn't they think of this before? And of course, it happens every time, right? Why else read the science journals otherwise? So I'm optimistic. I'm a cockeyed optimist. I did research for 38 years, and that's I was drawn to that field to begin with. So I never say no to anything until, well, I never say no to anything, actually.
Well, this is such a lively conversation. It can go on and on. I'm quite sure there's so many questions in the chat. I would be remiss if I didn't take one more minute to, in keeping with CTBUH's mission about future of cities, just ask the last final question. What will vertical farming look like in 5 to 10 years from now?
That's my favorite question because I don't have that answer, but I think I wrote that question actually. And I wrote it because I wanted to express my desire to see this as a partial solution to urbanization. Vertical farming is not an end in itself. It's a way to provide food for people in a closed environment. A city is a closed environment, basically. Some people live in cities all their lives and never move out, and they never have traveled beyond the streets where they grew up on. That's too bad for them, but they've got TV, I guess, to see what the rest of the world looks like. But to have their food coming from that area is only one part of that solution. We need fresh water, plenty of it. We need energy that's renewable. And we can make a building that has all of those features in it. And if you make it out of a material called cross-laminated timber, you can actually make it sequester carbon at the same time. So you've got a building that harvests rainwater, grows food, collects energy via photovoltaics, either clear or normal solar panels, and is made out of carbon. And that's the future. I think that is the future of the built environment, as I see it. And I would love to see every building in the built environment retrofitted, or as it's being built, planned for some crop that can be grown indoors. And if you do that enough in enough buildings, a couple of thousand buildings, and you've got every cuisine on earth.
Yeah.
So that's my hope for the future. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's what I would hope happens.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think if you think about when, electric cars were one of the first cars made, right? Were electric,
Right.
Yeah. And then there was the kind of the Chevy Volt, or these things. It took like Tesla to make it cool, right? So if you think it now, it's something that people aren't afraid of, but it's a status symbol. I think that vertical farming in cities is something that we have to up awareness. We're working on a project right now, a luxury apartment building, where we're putting a community garden on the roof, right? As a way to let's say indoctrinate the amenitized elite that food is an amenity, right? So we're intermixing that with the pool and the things. You get this winter garden that's not just a place that uses energy, but it's a place that they can have their own plot in the city to grow a garden right on the roof. So we hope that that's being seen from a distance, and that together with the grocery store on the ground floor starts to put together the connection of food and where we buy it. So it may not be a perfect model, but it's one that hopefully people will become aware of. There are a couple of questions in the chat that I don't think we're going to get to, but what I'm going to do is send those to the panelists, and you guys might get a direct answer from some of the panelists if that's all right with you guys. But I know that we're running over time right now, Janine, so I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. You're all experts. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And to all the audience members, thank you very much for participating. We look forward to you attending our next program. So please follow us on LinkedIn, CTBUH Philadelphia. We also have a website on the CTBUH main headquarters site. So again, thank you all. Truly amazing content.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Great time to spend an afternoon. Great way. So thanks everybody for your time and input, and thanks everybody for watching. It's really great to have such an audience. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott.
See you all soon.
Bye.
Thank you.